Being a master racket technician can mean a lot of good things, but one negative is the constant question: how do you string tennis rackets? Well, today I'd like to show you just that. Today I'm using an electronic stringer that has 6 mounting points for my racket. So all I need to do is put the racket up and tighten the mounts. Second order of business is to cut the strings, and for this job I have a flush wire cutter, and it does a pretty good job of cutting on the strings. And of course you can't string the racket if you don't take the string out, so I will go ahead and do that. To actually begin the racket, I will pull about 3.5 arm lengths of string for my mains, and I will go ahead and put that through the middle of the racket on the top side. Once that's done, I will grab my clamp and tighten it, and I'll grab my starting clamp, which is the little green thing, and I will put that on the other side of the clamp, opposite to where I will pull tension from. The starting clamp is useful to prevent any slips with the string, which is definitely a bad day. So there are some important things to note about tennis rackets, and one of those things is you have your mains and your crosses. The mains are the vertical strings that I'm doing right now, and the crosses are the horizontal strings, which I will get to in a minute or two. It's also important to note that when you do mains, you want to do 4 on one side, so pull tension on 4, and then do the other side completely like I've done, and get back to the other side and finish that off. So about 4, 8, and then the last 4. The number for this 4-8-4 pattern can vary if you have a bigger racket that actually has 18 mains instead of 16 like mine does. It's now time to make knots on my mains. So, knots are important in order to keep the tension of the strings in place. If we didn't have them, then the strings would, of course, slip, and stringing a racket wouldn't have much purpose. There's a multitude of knots you can use, but for my purposes, I like using what's called the Parnell knot, but it's certainly not limited to that. Now it's time to string the crosses. With the crosses, I pull a little bit less string than I do for the mains, about 3.25 arm lengths full. And I begin by starting at the top of the racket and putting some string through. And you'll notice I use my starting clamp from earlier to be on the outside of the racket when I pull tension. This is quite a popular technique for people to use to start crosses, and it's one I certainly like. So now I'm going to pull tension, and you'll notice that not only does it make the second string tight, but also the first one, and this force is counteracted by the green starting clamp. One technique I use is called stringing one ahead, which is always having a row of string on the crosses that are not tensioned, and that makes weaving on the next cross over a lot easier. Once I have a clamp on my third string, I will go ahead and pull tension on the very first string and change my second clamp to that, so now it has tension pulled on the first string, and I'll tie my knot to make sure that stays tight. From here on out, it's just repeating the same process for about 12, 13, 14 more times. And yeah, I just have to weave in and out with my string. Make sure there's no mistakes. It is pretty easy to make a mistake, but you will certainly feel it if you do. And one thing to note when pulling strings through the racket after you've already weaved is to kind of claw them up towards the bottom of the racket. And that's to avoid friction on the main hitting area of the racket, where most friction will be caused while playing. If you don't do this, you could burn the string and lower the overall life of the string, which you certainly don't want to happen. Now the crosses get a little harder towards the end when the strings get a little tighter, and you just have to take a little more time to be careful you don't make mistakes. And once that's done, it's time to tie the knot. And for this, you'll notice I go over the opposite side of where I enter with the string and make a little loop, and then I'll go over again and put the string through that loop. And I'll tighten the first entrance of the string and then the second part to make sure everything is tightened correctly. And the last order of business is to straighten out the strings which kind of arch towards the bottom, and then the racket is ready to be played with.